The rain had been falling since early that morning. By 5 o'clock, the sidewalks were nearly empty, and people hurried through the streets with their heads down, trying to get home before the evening became any colder. Daniel stood outside the grocery store, holding a small paper bag. Inside were three things he needed for dinner: a loaf of bread, a can of soup, and a carton of milk. He checked his wallet before putting it back into his coat pocket. There wasn't much left. Daniel had spent the entire afternoon looking for work. Three places had turned him down. One manager had promised to call him, but Daniel already knew what that usually meant. He stepped away from the store and started walking toward the bus stop. That's when he noticed her. A little girl stood underneath the awning of a closed bookstore. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old. She was wearing a yellow raincoat that was far too thin for the weather, and in her hand was a bright red balloon. Daniel slowed down. The girl wasn't crying. She wasn't asking for any money. She was simply standing there watching every person who passed by. One by one, they walked past her. A man in a business suit, an elderly woman carrying groceries, a young couple sharing an umbrella. Nobody stopped. Daniel looked down toward the street. Then he looked back at the little girl. He continued walking. For several seconds, he tried to convince himself that someone else would help her. Surely her parents were nearby. Surely someone knew where she belonged. Surely this wasn't his responsibility. But after a few steps, Daniel stopped. He turned around. The little girl was still there. He walked toward her. Are you okay? She looked up at him. Yes. Where's your mother? The little girl pointed toward the corner. She went inside the building. Daniel looked at the building. It was an old apartment complex. What's your name? Lily? Daniel smiled. That's a pretty name. Lily looked down at her balloon. My mom said red is the color of courage. Daniel noticed something about the way she said it. She wasn't playing. She was waiting. Are you waiting for her? Lily nodded. She told me to stay right here. Daniel glanced toward the apartment building again. Something didn't feel right. He crouched down so they were at the same height. How long have you been waiting? Lily looked at the red balloon. I don't know. Daniel looked at his watch. It had been nearly an hour since the bookstore had closed. He could feel the cold coming through his coat. He looked at the grocery bag in his hand. Then he looked at Lily. For a moment he thought about the money in his pocket. It wasn't enough for much. But he reached into his coat anyway. He took out the $5 bill he had. He walked into the nearby convenience store. For a few minutes later, he came back with a small cup of hot chocolate. He handed it to Lily. Her eyes lit up. For me? For you. She held the cup with both hands. Thank you. Daniel sat beside her. Neither of them spoke for a while. Cars passed. Rain tapped against the awning. The red balloon moved gently in the wind. Finally, Lily looked at him. Are you waiting for someone? Daniel smiled. Nope. She tilted her head. Then why are you here? Daniel didn't have an answer. Not one. he could easily explain. He had spent the entire day feeling like a failure. He had been thinking about everything he didn't have: the job he couldn't find, the bills he couldn't pay, the future he couldn't figure out. Yet somehow, sitting beside this little girl, none of those things seems as important as they had 10 minutes ago. Then Lily said something that Daniel would remember for the rest of his life. My mom said, when you don't know what to do, help someone who does. Daniel looked at her. Your mom said that? Lily nodded. Daniel smiled. Your mom is a wise woman. She is. A few minutes later, a woman came running around the corner. Her face was filled with panic. Lily! The little girl jumped up. Mommy! The woman rushed toward her and wrapped both arms around her. I told you to stay right here. I did. The woman looked at Daniel. Then she noticed the empty cup beside Lily. Did you give her that? Daniel nodded. Thank you. He stood up. You're welcome. The woman reached into her purse. Please, let me give you something. Daniel shook his head. Nope, it's okay. He picked up his grocery bag. Then he started walking toward the bus stop. He didn't notice the woman watching him. He didn't know that she had seen the worn out shoes. She didn't know about the empty bank account. Neither of them knew that their lives would cross again. Daniel got on the bus. He sat beside the window. As the bus pulled away, he looked back. Lily was still standing underneath the awning. She held the red balloon in one hand and waved with the other. Daniel waved back. For the first time that day, he smiled. Nothing but his circumstances had changed. He still didn't have a job. His bills were still waiting at home. There was still uncertainty about tomorrow. But something inside him had changed. That little girl had reminded him that something he had forgotten. Compassion doesn't quite require abundance. You don't have to have everything figured out before you give something to someone else. Sometimes you can be struggling and still be a blessing. Sometimes the person who think they have nothing to offer is carrying exactly what someone else needs. Daniel thought he was the one helping Lily that night. He didn't realize that Lily had helped him too. She reminded him that his life still had value, that his circumstances didn't define his worth. And perhaps most importantly, she reminded him that God can use an ordinary moment to redirect a discouraged heart. Scripture tells us in Galatians 6 and verse 9, and let us not be weary in well doing. Daniel didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew what he could do today. He could keep walking, he can keep believing, and he could keep looking for opportunities to do good, even when life wasn't going the way he had planned. Because compassion isn't only something you give when you have more than enough. Sometimes compassion is what keeps us human when we feel like we have nothing left to give. So the next time you pass someone who seems invisible, don't be so quick to look away. You may never know what they're carrying, and you may never know what your smallest act of kindness could mean to them. Daniel thought he had stopped for a little girl holding a red balloon. Maybe in that moment, God had stopped him from a different reason. Maybe he needed to remind that even in the hardest days of our lives, we can still become an answer to someone else's prayer. And sometimes the blessing isn't in what we receive, it's in discovering that we still have something to give.